Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for your viewership and your listenership. This has been such a great effort, and we couldn't do it without your support. And I gotta make the request. If you are watching us on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a review. But also you might want to check us out on one of those fine podcast platforms that's out there, Spotify and Apple and Google and Amazon, wherever. I'm an Amazon guy myself. Let your friends know, let your family members know, let your family members' friends, let your friends' family members know all about the Lunch Hour at Federal Newswire. So listen, I'm going to peel back the curtain a little bit here. This is I'm going to say third time's the charm for this interview. Had a great chat with our guest a couple of weeks back at CPAC, and because even though I've been doing podcasting for more than a decade now, every once in a while I will have a major technical glitch, and boy did I have one here. So by his great graces, we are joined once again by Pedro Israel Orta. He's an author. We're going to talk about him. He's a Miami-born son of Cuban immigrants who fled the tyranny of Fidel Castro's communism. He brings his 18-year experience as a CIA veteran to this memoir, the memoir of we're going to talk about it, having served in war-torn regions like Iraq, Afghanistan, and other undisclosed locations in the Middle East, and at the Inspector General for the Intelligence Committee working on whistleblower issues. His bravery in exposing abuses of power led to his own retribution and termination, despite earning 8 exceptional performance awards for his contributions to U.S. national security, mostly in counterterrorism operations. He's the author of the seminal work that I just referenced. It's called The Broken Whistle, a deep state run amok, found wherever fine books are found. He served for 14 years in the U.S. Army before joining CIA. And before joining CIA, also had a career in sales. He is an evangelical minister as well, and he calls Tulsa, Oklahoma well. Pedro, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleasure to be here on your show today.
So, here's the thing, right? I mean, what I love is this is a conversation that I love having because it's such a vital and important issue. The issue of, both from the standpoint of the intelligence community and where it is and your work and the problems that you've seen. Here's what I come back to, right? I had this conversation with somebody just yesterday about the issue of the politicization of law enforcement and the intelligence community. And we went through this and would say, well, this is an unprecedented level of politicization. The problem is that it isn't, that the FBI and CIA and other agencies have been politicized before, and yet we took steps to change this. Talk about the church committee, talk about what was going on long before you joined CIA and what led to the reforms and what those reforms were supposed to be.
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, what we're dealing with today is nothing new.
Yeah.
I mean, we had these problems back in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And back then, there was technically no congressional oversight of the intelligence community. So, I mean, they seriously were doing their own thing until eventually it caught up with them, and it led to the church committee. I mean, we were talking about some serious abuses of power, conflicts of interest, using the CIA to topple governments to benefit the private interest as bankers who were affiliated with the CIA. That happened in Central America, Guatemala. Vast abuses of power. Eventually, yes, church committee, Frank Church senator from Idaho, initiated some proceedings. And the most important aspect of it is the outcome. The outcome was the institution of the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee of Intelligence as oversight bodies for Congress to have a direct effect as far as how and what the intelligence community was doing. Mechanisms of reporting, mechanisms for funding, mechanisms to adjudicate alleged violations of laws and so forth. And the process began to work, and it actually diminished the power of the CIA. to a degree. But then you fast forward to the 1980s, and the CIA became again a very powerful element of the executive branch of government under President Reagan, and it continued to increase in power. And you fast forward to 2000s, 9/11. Now you have a proliferation of technology that came to be a factor. So now you're looking at increased technological powers and additional powers given to the intelligence community through the Patriot Act, the Intelligence Reform Act that established the Office of Director of National Intelligence. And you combine the politics of looking back as far as the different administrations. You had Bill Clinton, Bush, Obama. Obama appointed some very strong political operatives to go into the CIA. Brennan, for example, most significant, and Clapper in the DNI. And we began to see a process where these intelligence community elements began to politicize their powers to conduct basically operations in favor of the Democrats and Democratic operatives. So you basically had a going back to history and seeing the problems we saw in the 50s and the 60s happening again, but in this particular instance, more for political purposes instead of private interests.
I want to get into individual directors in a second, but this is a perfect point because it gets very much into your book, The Broken Whistle, because we talk about this issue of course, I just lost my train of thought there. No. We talk about this issue of oversight, the importance of oversight. I'm reminded of that movie, The Good Shepherd, which, of course, is a fictionalized version of the founding of the CIA. Lee Pace playing a gentleman who's supposed to be very much like Richard Helms, saying at the tail end of the movie, Congress wants to peek into our closets like we're going to let them do it. But, of course, there has to be some level of oversight. The problem is that oversight isn't happening for a number of reasons. Talk about why it's not happening, the problems with oversight and the co-option of the oversight committees. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And that's it. You nailed it. There is a lack of oversight. And that's basically the main point, element, thesis of the broken whistle, deep state run amok. What has happened is Congress has failed to follow through to hold the intelligence community accountable for their abuses of power. And I'll give you two specific examples.
Please.
We have Brennan, who abused his powers over the investigation of the torture tactics, interrogation tactics, rendition program of the CIA, where something happened in which technically the CIA was to a degree spying on the computer system, trying to find out what the House committee members were doing to do oversight. And he actually lied about it and never held in contempt, never held responsible for it. There's another instance of Brennan doing the same tactic, listening to or actually reading the email traffic back and forth between the Office of Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, the whistleblower office, and whistleblowers that were reporting on CIA wrongdoing related to these same issues of basically the rendition and the interrogation program. But nothing was done to Brennan. Congress failed to hold them in contempt or hold them accountable for such actions. And then there's the case of Clapper basically just flat out lying publicly about the signals intelligence about not collecting on Americans. I find it most interesting, though, that in this particular case, Congress knew the details of these programs.
Right.
And a lot of them feigned that they did not know. But one of the senators, Senator Wyden, wanted to get it on the record, and he did get it on the record. So Clapper lied.
Wow.
A serious offense to Congress.
Right.
And again, here the issue is Congress has failed to hold them accountable.
Right.
So the bottom line is Congress has allowed these agencies to, at times, push the envelope on operations like the Russia hoax. It is a Russia hoax. Call it what it is. Using the powers of the intelligence community to target political operatives on the Republican side because they don't like the Republican politics. That's a serious illegality. In one country, Colombia, South America, their equivalent of the FBI was caught doing the same thing. They shut down that agency and imprisoned some of the high-level officials caught in that scandal. That's how serious such an act is. But here we have these things going on, and Congress has not done anything. They continue to fund. They continue to allow these agencies to abuse these powers without any, accountability. And that just further empowers these agencies and these operatives to do these acts.
It really is insane. I come back to this, right? The problem, of course, being that as much as we all might perceive the resources of the intelligence community to be infinite, they're not infinite. They are finite. And when you are choosing to engage in program X, by and large, you are probably not choosing to engage in program Y. Or if you're looking at target X, you may not be looking as closely as at target I. And so one of the things I'm reminded of, right, is in the wake of the Church Committee, 1974, 1975, Jimmy Carter gets elected in 76. Stansfield Turner becomes CIA director in 77, 70, I'm not sure exactly when he was confirmed. He fires a whole host of case officers and other operatives from CIA. And we miss as a nation, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. And we understand what happened then and, the lasting results in terms of the destabilization of the world as a result of that invasion in 1979. By the same token, Bill Clinton becomes elected. He gets elected in 92. The Cold War is over, largely, or at least we think it is. And again, lots of agents fired, lots of assets fired. We wind up missing in the end 9/11. And I guess I know there was a change in leadership. And of course, George W. Bush, when he came in, was focused on China. But the point is, these things matter. And so now where we have the Russia threat, the legitimate threat of Russia and the Russian government, we have threats in China. We have threats in this is my point. I'm sorry, Pedro, as I sort of ramble around this. When you are so focused on the connection of and investigating the possible connection of a president of the United States or candidate for president of the United States to the Russians, and you're fed a whole rasher of horse dung from the Russian intelligence service, you may wind up, missing what they're doing vis-a-vis Ukraine or vis-a-vis Syria. These things matter, do they not? That's, I guess, where I'm going. It's a very long way of saying these things matter.
I mean, your point is finite resources and misguided resources will cause a failure of a lot of these intelligence processes.
Right.
For example, all the signals that were missed with 9/11, there were plenty of indicators that an attack was going to happen, but they were not focused on trying to find out what was going on. You also had a lot of interagency rivalries. Agencies not sharing information. That still happens today, despite the fact that.
Let's talk about that, because we had this creation of the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which I think I quipped to you the other day when I heard this. In the wake of 9/11, they're like, okay, we need a federal agency to manage national emergencies, to which I said, you mean like a federal emergency management agency? We need an agency that's supposed to centralize intelligence collection and analysis. And so, you mean like a central intelligence agency? We have this ODNI that's supposed to solve this problem, and yet it doesn't talk about that.
I mean, the theory of having an ODNI is noble and it's a good intention, and you can't fault them for that. But the reality is that the typical government response is there's a problem. Let's throw money and people at the problem.
Right.
And money and people are going to fix it. But in reality, what you end up is you end up making the problem bigger, because now you got more money and more people doing the same thing that you were doing before. And now it makes it even harder to coordinate at times. You have extra layers of coordination, extra layers of people involved. It's just more red tape and more bureaucracy, and that's not the answer. And we've seen our failure in our intelligence community by having a lot of redundancy. You have got 17 plus members of the intelligence community. You have got so many people out there doing, intelligence analysis, It's almost at times, I remember a story of one briefer going to a major principal, and the major principal said, "You are like my third briefing today. And this is the third time I've heard about this problem, but all three of you have a different opinion of what's going on. The three of you need to get together and tell me what the blank is going on."
Right.
Because, I mean, I'm not getting any good information from the three of you. You're making things worse.
It's a bad sign when the three different entities are unaware of what the other two are doing. That's a legitimate problem. That's why things get, and I have nothing but respect and admiration for the folks who do this very tough work. I mean, it is very difficult work under very trying conditions. And we also understand, right, Pedro, this idea of everybody wants to keep their own secrets, right? And every entity wants to, and I'm going to say this, I don't mean this to cast aspersions, every entity wants to justify its own existence. Do you ever see the movie Wag the Dog?
Yeah.
All right. So, Robert De Niro has this whole line where he's sort of talking about the fact, well, if you don't see this threat out of Albania, what good are you? Why are we funding you? I mean, if you don't see this, which is the whole point of sort of the tail wagging the dog. But that's part of it. They have their secrets. Again, I don't mean that in a bad way, and they guard them jealously. That I do mean in a bad way. They want to make sure that they are justified. The DIA not wanting to share with CIA, not wanting to share with FBI counterintelligence. But the flip side, of course, is what we don't want is this level of coordination between CIA and FBI and DOJ when it comes to these political shenanigans. That's the only thing they seem to be able to coordinate well, is when they're going after a political target.
Sadly, that is the truth. And I mean, there is a place to have these intelligence agencies and these capabilities, and they can make a difference when they're working. And I mean, I can give you two examples during the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Prior to that, I mean, thankfully, we had the U-2 airplanes that were flying over the Soviet Union, and we were able to really know what was going on in the Soviet Union as far as their capabilities. At the same time, we had one human intelligence asset reporting to the CIA, Pentokev, I believe is his name, who actually got caught and basically was executed for giving his secrets away. But he gave out valuable secrets as far as what was going on in the Soviet nuclear capabilities. But these are rare examples. I mean, you can actually count the number of real intelligence successes. You have got so much red tape and so much bureaucracy where it's just money that's just being misspent by the sheer volume of activities. And a lot of these activities are just basically the tail, it's the tail of the dog, being wagged.
Right.
And it's just mindless, unnecessary redundancy, and it's all for the sake of justifying the budgets.
Right. And one would think, so actually this is good because this gets into an examination of good versus bad CIA directors, right? Folks who understand the mission and are going and pursuing the mission. I would put, now you may disagree with me. Actually, let me get your thoughts before I prejudice you. Bob Gates. Robert Gates, good CIA director, bad CIA director?
I say a little bit mixed because there are some concerns about politicization, where he basically was just a political animal feeding to his principals what they wanted to hear. And that's not a good CIA director.
Hold on, time out for a second. Actually, let's pull that back for a second, because that actually gets into this issue because we talked a little bit about Democrats and Republicans, but some of this is about establishment versus non-establishment, right? So if you are Bob Gates, I want to say appointed by George H.W. Bush, right? No, Bob Gates appointed by George W. Bush and then also served for Barack Obama, as I recall. Did he not?
Yes.
Anyway, so you would think, okay, well, he served with Republicans and conservative Republicans. He served for liberal Democrats. But really what it's about the establishment as opposed to the disruptors. Mike Pompeo, disruptor. Leon Panetta, an establishmentarian, though I think he was probably on balance a good CIA director. Go ahead.
I mean, from my perspective, I was there from 2000 to 2018.
Got it.
So I worked under Tenet, Hayden, Porter Goss, Panetta, Petraeus, Michael Morrell acting at one point in time. We had Brennan and then Pompeo. From my perspective, my dealings with them, I actually briefed Porter Goss, Michael Hayden, got to sit down one time with Leon Panetta. I saw Tenet, through some of my functions. Brennan, I was able to sit in on some of the briefings based on some of the things I was doing. And Pompeo, well, Panetta, in my opinion, was probably one of the better ones.
There we go. Okay,
He was a political operative, but he was also, how can I describe it accurately? Since he was a House of Representatives member, all politics is local, comes from Tip O'Neill. He was a true politician that knew how to do the job needed to be done, but at the same time represent the people he represents.
Right.
So he was representing the CIA, but at the same time working for the president, and he balanced both of those well. I can't say the same for others.
Right.
I was deeply disappointed with Pompeo for the simple fact that, from my perspective, it was clear to me that the CIA was running Pompeo instead of Pompeo running the CIA. And this gets into some dynamics that it's not only him, but it's other CIA directors, where the bureaucracy is so powerful. And it it doesn't happen just only with the intelligence community. It happens with other bureaucracies within the United States government. Some of these bureaucracies are so entrenched as far as powerful through the years that they've been operating that it's very hard for an outsider to come in and try to shape that organization and lead it to a different direction.
But this gets back into what we were talking about earlier, right? Because it's both the CIA staff running the director, but it's also the CIA staff running the oversight committees, which gets even more complicated when the oversight committees have to go to CIA to get their security class, their security credentials. And that's another sort of layer of this. It's like, this is what I said to you before, it's like when you have folks who get elected to city council, I'm going to bring it down to the lowest level, town council, city council, they have great reform ideas in mind, but then the professional city manager and the bureaucracy tells them what they can and can't do. And they're like, no, they're the elected officials. They have control. You need to sit down and sort of take your cues from the folks who are elected to do their job. This is part of the problem with oversight, isn't it?
That is correct. What happens here is these bureaucracies at times can actually tell the directors and political appointees and oversight committees what needs to be done, because they can choose to shape the narrative. They can choose to misinform, not provide all the information. They can be very selective as far as skewing the numbers and the data. And in the process, they put the political appointee or the oversight committee in a position where it's like, okay, well, I see what you're telling me. What you're telling me is that this is the way it should be done. And that's not the way it should be done, but that's the way it actually does happen.
It is crazy here. Let's step back for a second. Let's sort of talk about your journey here, because I think it's valuable that people understand this. You were raised in Florida. Let's start with this, which is, when did you come to the States from Cuba?
I was actually born and raised in Miami.
Okay, got it.
But my family came from Cuba in the early 60s. They had to flee Cuba because one of my granduncles' father's side was a political prisoner for 20 years.
Wow.
My grandfather was actually thrown in jail, but he managed to get out. And at that point in time, he had to flee the island before his wife, grandmother, and 3 sons and 1 daughter that followed a few months later. So I was born in that generation. They basically left everything, lost their businesses, their properties, their money, and started from zero here in the United States in Miami, not knowing one word of English. So that's my pedigree and my background. So I grew up in a Cuban household that knew about the perils of tyranny, communism, socialism, from a political oppressive perspective, as well as the economic tyranny that comes with it.
So, and that's interesting, because as I've talked about sort of on my own journey, political and policy wise, I came to my beliefs through ardent anti-communism. I've seen what communist dictatorships can do to people. I'm assuming it was the same for you. You went to college, and now I don't remember. Did you do sales first and then join the Army? Or did you join the Army first, and then when you came out, you did sales?
What I did was straight out of high school, I worked in the private sector for about 10 years, and then I enlisted in the Army Reserves, and I went back into Miami to do sales at the same time. So I worked in that tight-knit Cuban community, and I was affected by it from the perspective of seeing the evils of communism because of what my relatives were going through, separation through the years, At the same time, eventually when some relatives were able to go back and visit, I heard the horror stories of what they encountered over there. And I finally put myself through school at night, basically working full-time during the day, going to school at night to be able to get my degree. And once I got my degree in political science, I was able to eventually transition over to the CIA.
So let me ask you, I'm going to throw you a curveball here because we didn't talk about this before. So there's a lot of talk about sort of opening up the doors to Cuba. Certainly when we've had Democratic administrations, there's more of a pull to to try to engage in some kind of détente with the Cuban government. I think we've seen how these kinds of things backfired with China, in terms of trade there, with Russia. Certainly we don't have a stable democratic, classical liberal regime in Russia. What will it take to bring freedom to Cuba? What are your thoughts here?
That's a tough one. I mean,
right.
the political powers are so entrenched that it's almost impossible for the people to rise up and to topple it. It's going to have to be a situation where the leadership finally awakens and realizes this is not working. Sure. And I mean, part of it is going to be engagement. And the other part is going to be some tightening, some type of, restrictions. But there's no will in the people to topple the government because they're so impoverished,
right?
And they're so dependent on the state that for them to topple that government, nothing would really change.
Right.
There's no really clear answer as far as what will it take to change.
Well, it gets into the same questions that folks have about what happens, in the post-Kim era in North Korea. How does that happen? What is the transition that would have to happen there? It's funny because tomorrow a colleague of mine is doing some things on the Hill talking about that very issue. You're right. When there's it really gets into, it's funny, because it gets into what we spend a lot of time talking about in terms of the transformation of language and the transformation of narratives here at home. If you spend half a century essentially running down the language of freedom, such that folks distrust the concepts of freedom, the concepts that are that are found in the Constitution, it's no wonder that you won't have folks who are going to defend those terms down the road. And if you don't have folks who can defend those terms, here at home, then how possibly can we export those, right? We spend a lot of time talking about, spreading democracy abroad. I've always thought that that's a misnomer. What we should be spreading is the language of liberty. Hernando de Soto talks about this in The Mystery of Capital and The Other Path. Anyway, it's a point taken.
Yeah. So
you have this 18-year career in CIA. What makes you turn around and decide, okay, something is really wrong here? When did you first notice that something is wrong at CIA? And when did you make the decision? Why did you make the decision to say something about it?
I mean, it all culminated when I was serving in a war zone base in Afghanistan as a deputy chief of base. By the time I got out to this base, I had already done almost 6 years in a war zone. Iraq, Afghanistan, another war zone, another quasi-war zone location. I was trained by probably about a dozen senior leaders as far as what to do, what not to do in a war zone.
Right.
Death and life situations constantly in Iraq, Afghanistan. On top of that, before you go out as a deputy chief of base or a chief of base or a chief of station, deputy chief of station, you go through a rigorous training process as far as what is expected from one of these leaders. as far as what to do, what not to do. And I had to meet various different officials. I had to sit in a big panel where I met them all. And I go forward to that base. I get to that base, and I'm working for a chief of base who sadly, was it was one of those situations where they basically were trying to put a square peg in a round hole.
Oh boy.
They took a very nice lady who had really no overseas war zone experiences, who was not even a career director of operations, operational type officer. But this officer had just served in Europe for 3 years, mother of 3. Put her in a war zone where you constantly have rockets impacting around you, where you're separated from family. It's a dirty environment. The food is an issue. and she was stressed out.
Sure.
And in the process of being stressed out, she started creating a hostile work environment for somebody below us. On top of that, she was basically adopting sons. She was turning the base into a social club to, a coping mechanism for her.
Sure.
We were not meeting with the military. Our lives were being endangered in reality by going out for food, for yoga classes at times of increased rocket attacks. And the situation eventually blew up, and I spoke up for the subordinate.
In a metaphorical, hold on, to be really clear, blew up in a metaphorical sense. Sorry, go ahead, yes.
In a metaphorical sense. It just
want to be clear.
Yeah. I mean, it was almost as if a rocket impacted, though.
Sure, yes.
From what happened afterwards. Basically, I spoke up for a harassed and aggrieved subordinate and for our safety. And what they did was sent me home.
Wow.
Telling me we're going to get back to you and let you know how we're going to fix things. I'm home on leave, expecting to go back. Instead, I get called to CIA headquarters, and I'm informed that I would not be going back to Afghanistan.
Wow.
And I'm not told why. And I'm told you can apply for any job you want, and, you can just go forward. Well, when I finally
hold on, Pedro. You can apply for any job you want. We're not going to guarantee that you're going to get one of those other jobs, but you can apply for any job you want.
Exactly. So when I get back to CIA headquarters and I start figuring out what's going on here, basically I got sent home short of tour for cause that I had a leadership issue. This chief of base wrote a horrific performance appraisal. And every office that was supposed to help me to fix things was involved in basically call it what it is, a criminal conspiracy to cover up a retaliation for reporting EEO issues and also whistleblower protected disclosures related to Presidential Policy Directive 19.
Wow.
And I couldn't get a job. They wouldn't offer me any jobs. They would deny me for job after job after job. Adjudicating, fixing that performance appraisal was a nightmare.
Sure.
EEO was trying to kill a case. The IGs were trying to basically squash and kill a reprisal complaint. Grievance officer had no interest in helping. Human resources missing in action, or call them human assassination. It was just a complete disaster.
Sure.
And it led to me basically taking 2 months of leave without pay to get out of that toxic environment while I waited to take what's known as a joint duty assignment with the Office of Inspector General for the Intelligence Community. I had to run from the CIA to find a safe place to work.
Sure. Wow.
And that's just round one.
And I empathize as someone who's been down the road of being in an organization where you raise some issues that are affecting you and your fellow employees, and then 6 months later finding yourself eerily similar, having to deal with going through the adjudication process and getting your day, not necessarily in court, but getting your day of review, and also, oh, by the way, being told you can apply for a job down the road and not have that available. I've been there, so not in nearly as serious circumstances as yours. So I don't want to take anything away from what you're saying. But the point is, you learned an important lesson when you push back, especially when, and it sounds like this person was put in this position for political reasons, when you say, hey, we're dealing with life, death situations here, things that impact the national security of the United States, maybe, just maybe we shouldn't be playing politics. They pushed back very hard against you, didn't they?
They did. I mean, basically, their modus operandi is bully and beat a complainant to the point that they will either resign, quit, and leave, or until they just completely shut up. Not realizing that, all those years that I grew up in Miami, with the anti-tyranny, the hard work, putting myself through school at night while I work full-time, working hard jobs in perishable commodities, all those years of war zone work, working 80 hours a week, developed a very strong spirit inside of me that I could withstand such ridiculous behaviors. And they did not expect me to basically survive it, and I very well did.
They underestimated you to their detriment. Again, I've been there in many ways. So once again, the book, The Broken Whistle. What's the subtitle?
A Deep State Run Amok. And
it's available wherever fine books are found. What's been the reception for the book, Pedro?
People either love it or hate it. And basically the reason why they love it because if they realize that we have some serious issues in our government.
Yeah.
And then those that hate it tend to be the liberals who believe that government can do no wrong.
So here's this interesting, right? Let's talk about that for a second. Because if it hadn't been for, and I'm going to say progressive instead of liberal right now, if it hadn't been for longstanding progressive distrust of government power, especially the defense intelligence establishment community, we would not have had the church committee, right? We wouldn't have had the reforms that were proposed there. And yet here we are now, because now they're establishmentarian. Donald Trump represents a threat to the establishment. So anything that Donald Trump does, we have to be opposed to. Now they see it as a tool. I guess it gets down to this. I'm sorry, Pedro. To me, one of the great lessons of the 1960s, and I was a student of the 60s, I wasn't born then, but I'm a big fan of protest movements and doing research about protest movements. One of the great failures of the 1960s was that they saw the amoral or out-and-out immoral abuses of power by a government run amok. They then took power in the post-Watergate, post-Richard Nixon era, and they passed some reforms, as you said, the church committee, but they really didn't do anything to take back that executive branch power because somebody realized, something? We're going to be in power again someday. We can use this power to our advantage. That's why they didn't take back that power. That's why we're seeing them being the darlings or them loving the intelligence community now. Am I wrong here, Pedro?
There's an element of truth there.
Okay.
One point I do need to make and get across is up until 2016, the left, the press, Democratic operatives, Democratic congressional members, despised and to a degree did not like the intelligence community.
Good point.
And they always led the charge to hold the intelligence community accountable for what they deemed to be abuses of power.
Sure.
Fast forward to 2016. Now you've got the entrenched political operatives in the intelligence community at the White House abusing those powers to go after a political opponent, Donald Trump as candidate for the president.
Right.
And all his basically advisors. So they turned these powers loose to go after him.
Right.
So now all those political operatives and congressional members that historically were against the intelligence community were now on the side of the intelligence community because they wanted to use those powers to go after Trump.
A prime example, John Schindler. I don't know if you're familiar with John Schindler's work, former NSA counterintelligence specialist, taught at the Naval War College along with a guy named Tom Nichols, the two of them sort of going hand in hand to be spokespeople for the IC in terms of going after Trump. I'll never forget John le Carré, right? John le Carré, the famed spy author, doing an interview with Terry Gross in which he's making all of these bold predictions about the compromat, the compromising information that the intelligence community had on Donald Trump, and that literally saying that they had him by the hairs on a certain part of people's body, that if you pull them, it hurts very much. And of course, none of that ever happened, but it was very clear that John le Carre was being fed information from the intelligence community, the John Schindlers of the world. This is what we're talking about here. These folks sort of turned around and became the self-appointed Avengers, the folks supposedly inside the White House. Sorry to speak to this, Pedro. I apologize.
I mean, that's exactly what has happened here. What you've got is we've got power, and we have the ability to use that power against a political opponent, and we can pick and choose what information we want to pass along, how we want to pass it along, what kind of narrative we want to shape. And this opens up another issue, which is basically, if you start looking at every single time the government investigates itself, there are fundamental flaws to such investigations.
Of course.
They almost have predetermined outcomes. It's like we were going to find exactly what we want to find, how we want to find it, when we want to find it. And it goes back to one of the main things we've spoken about here. How do we do effective oversight to stop all of this?
Right. Sorry, go ahead. And how do we?
How do we? Well, the prime example is the church committee.
Right.
We may have to reinstitute a brand new church committee, and this time potentially bring in outsiders who are going to be not political operatives or not biased towards one side or the other side. We may need some reputable academics, reputable business people. Some of the names out there who basically are good are like Alan Dershowitz, Jonathan Turley, Victor Davis Hanson, Elon Musk, and some other business people who can call a spade and, an ace an ace. Rather than just pervert the truth.
It was Jonathan Turley. I first took notice of Jonathan Turley, and I don't know if you're familiar. You'll appreciate this. I'm going to digress for a second, Pedro, for everybody else out there. I first learned about Jonathan Turley back in the 90s when he was representing the families of folks who had worked at the base, the operating base at Area 51 at Nellis Air Force Base, essentially the Skunk Works Lockheed plant there, or station there, where they were testing out stealth material. And it's a closed base, which I'm sure you know this, but if it's a closed base, nothing comes off the base. So everything was being doused in jet fuel and set on fire, including very highly noxious stealth material for stealth airplanes. And as a result, many of the workers got sick. So they went to Jonathan Turley, who was then a very junior professor at George Washington University. And they said, will you represent us? And he said, sure. And they sued the government. And the government's first line of defense was, well, no such base exists. We deny it. We don't deny any of the stuff we just deny the base exists. And anybody who tells you the base exists, well, they're violating many, many security oaths that they took. And you can't identify the base. And he said, well, it's Area 51. Well, we don't have a base called Area 51. We have an operating area near Groom Lake. Well, anyway, so it was a whole back and forth for many, many years. I'm not even sure. But it's exactly what we're talking about here. They went and they cordoned off Jonathan Turley's office. They slapped police tape around front of his office because he had all of this supposedly classified material in there. So that's how I'm a big appreciator.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
But you just opened up another line of emphasis here.
Right.
One of the biggest problems that we have in government oversight is all these government attorneys that are literally criminals. Call them what they are. They're committing criminal acts to cover up government corruption and government violations of laws. And, in reality, what they should be doing is writing criminal referrals to the Department of Justice for the Department of Justice to investigate the criminals within the government. But that's never going to happen.
You get a former CIA case officer, Nellie Orr, goes and she gets hired by Fusion GPS to investigate a candidate for president. She goes and she gets a ham radio operator's license to presumably run her operative in the field, Chris Steele. But her husband is a senior DOJ official, so there's no way we're going to find out what happened, and B, she's never going to get prosecuted. Listen, Pedro, before I let you go, because we're running short on time here, you are also a lay minister Talk a little bit about that. Talk about what you do in your spare time, when you have spare time.
Yeah, but I'm an ordained minister, trained in evangelism, trained to teach. And I spent 2 months in Tanzania with Christ for All Nations doing an evangelism crusade type work. I trained with Christ for All Nations in their evangelism boot camp. And I went to Rhema Bible Training College and I did the 2-year program. And essentially, I have a 501c3, Pedro Israel Orta Evangelistic Association. And the goal of my 501c3 is to be able to raise funds and be able to fund other evangelists to go out and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ.
That's great.
I haven't been able to completely do this on a full-time basis, given the fact that the book has taken a significant amount of time. But the book is very important because this truth of the abuse of government power is too important not for it to go out.
Listen, these are both important missions, but God is putting you where you need to be. The book, of course, is a Broken Whistle, The Deep State Run Amok. The author is Pedro Israel Orta. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. God bless you.
Thank you. And this has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Remember, leave us a review, subscribe. If you're watching us on YouTube, listen to us on those fine podcast platforms. If you are watching us on that fine podcast on YouTube, anyway, you get what I'm saying here as I go off on a tangent. Thank you all very much for tuning in once again. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.